The topic today is Greece's accession to the European Community in the 1970s and 1980s, and a question, which is a very good one to be asking at the moment, was it a mistake? And I think this is, your timing could not be better on this particular subject. Many of you will know Dr. Karamouzi, who's here as the Leventis visiting fellow in CSOX, the Southeast European Studies at Oxford. She has an MSc in European Politics and Governance and a PhD in International History, both from the LSE. And there is another connection with St. Antony's, and that is that she was supervised or tutored? Supervised by Deighton. Examined, sorry. I knew there was a connection. Her main research interests, are in the history of European integration and the relationship between Greece and the European Community and then the European Union. She's also very interested in the contemporary history of the Balkans and is currently editing, is this it? No, a volume on the Balkans and the Cold War, which will come out this year. A lot of you will know Professor Deighton, who has a long connection with St. Antony's College. He was here for 6 years and then moved to Wolfson College, but we're very glad that she has kept up a very strong connection with this college, and she's also been in the Department of Politics and International Relations for some years. Yes. And is an expert on the early history of Europe and the Cold War, among other things on NATO, and also an expert on Ernest Bevin, and she will be commenting on Dr. Karamouzi's lecture. And so Dr. Karamouzi will speak for approximately 40 minutes. We'll then have 10 minutes or so of commentary, and then we hope that you will all come in with questions and comments. So welcome, both of you, and we'll leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for chairing and for commenting again on my work. Hopefully I did a better job with the book. A little bit talk about this. The question is, because of everything is happening, was it a mistake? But I'll try to explain where my journey kind of began and how we ended up with the book. So initially, the idea was to write a thesis about, I was interested in enlargement in general, and I always thought that Greece made an interesting case study, first because it was completely understudied when I started in 2007. But also, I was always struck how enlargement, not all of the studies, but most of the studies have an introspective character. They really are much more interested on the applicant itself, so why an applicant seeks to gain membership. And what I wanted to do, in contrast, and I was following other people's example, like Piers Ludlow, who was my supervisor at the time, was to look at the behavior and the attitude of the member states. So why do the Europeans move on with membership? How do they justify it? How do they go along to do it? Therefore, my interest was to see at the discussions that were taking place in Brussels. And what do I mean by that? Within the European institutions, in the Commission, in the Council of Ministers, in the newly created at the time European Council in the mid-70s, and also the European Parliament. Therefore, the idea was that the institutional reaction to an application. And the case study would be Greece. Greece, why? Well, to tell you the truth, it was linguistic. In the beginning, nobody could read Greek. I thought, okay, I could tap into that. But then it became much more than that, because Greece is an interesting case, because until 2014, with the exception of Croatia, it was the sole example of a single country entry. And I was always kind of intrigued, why did they not enter with Spain and Portugal? Why did they do it on their own in the 1970s? And also because it was after the first enlargement, before Spain and Portugal, I always thought it would be a good case study to test the evolution of the community. How much did it change from the first round, there were different kind of applicants to Greek and vice versa. Therefore, there were many benefits about it. And also Greece had a Cold War story because of NATO, because of the crisis in the mid-70s that I will go to talk about much more. Of course, when I was writing the book, the crisis erupted, 2010, which completely changed the way I was looking at the membership talks, and it made me realize what Mark Gilbert has been saying, that we need to, as European integrationist historians, we need to kind of move away from this teleological approach of how we write European integration. We take for granted that there's a progressive movement towards an ever closer union, whereas this is not the case. We need to take a step back and think that we need to place the enlargement talks in a specific moment and realize that at all junctures they were different paths and multiple choices that were available. And only if you see it as part of a social, political, and economic transformation that was taking place in the 70s, only then you can really understand what was happening with Greece. But what intrigued it and make it very interesting is that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the then president of France, in a talk in 2012, said to Schmidt, saying that it was a mistake. He said, to be perfectly frank, it was a mistake to accept Greece. Greece simply wasn't ready. Greece is basically an Oriental country. Helmut, I recall that you expressed skepticism before Greece was accepted into the European community in 1981. You were wiser than me. This is 2012, and his whole idea, and it was one of the most high-level actors to really kind of dive into the fray and make this link and add to the blame game that was taking place, especially in 2012, about the origins of the current crisis and how much we need to go back to the actual accession. Therefore, to move from this short-termist and a historical analysis, what I tried to do in the book and in the thesis was that I employed the multi-level and multi-archival analysis. Multi-archival because, as I said, I was much more interested to know what the Europeans were thinking, but also a huge part of my research for the book much more was also the American archives. You will be shocked to know how much more open actually the Western Europeans were to their American counterparts than between themselves. They felt that at least the Germans were much more straightforward, and the British, of course, discussing the Greek issue than within the European institutions. And then regarding the multi-level, enlargement has several frameworks, and as you can now know from the crisis, there's different forums where you can negotiate, but the usual is the bilateral. So it's the Council of Ministers negotiating with the applicant, which is a very formal setting. What happens is that each side kind of presents their common position over the various enlargement dossier. And usually most enlargement studies actually just investigate that first level. And that first level is completely boring. Nothing is happening. It's just a mere presentation. What is very interesting is what happens at the internal level, which is before they meet with Greece, which is my case, they have the 9, which was the 9 member state at the time, need to find a common position before they present it to the applicant. And this is where the true bargaining took place, because they had to, they were open about what their concerns. The whole idea of what was wrong or what was good about the Greek case was discussed among the 9. And this is where you get if you go into the EEC archives and the member states archives. And then is the informal one, which was the dinners and everything that was taking place on the margins. Of course, I cannot quantify that how much I was getting, but the British archives are the best diplomatic gossip around. They were really kind of reporting back what was happening in extremely good detail. And it kind of goes, confirms what Otland, which was the Deputy General Secretary of the community at the time, said it was indeed in the privacy of the dining room that compromises were usually sought and found on sensitive issues. So this is my, in a way, let's say, methodology. So let's give you a little bit of background story, what happened. So this is Konstantinos Karamanlis, who was the then Prime Minister of Greece. There's another Karamanlis down the line, his nephew, who ruled 2004-2009. But this Konstantinos Karamanlis applied for membership on 12 June 1975, only several years after the first accession had taken place when Britain, Ireland, and Denmark became members. And the truth is that he presented this application as a long-lasting measure to protect the country's nascent democratic institutions, because as you may know, Greece was under the rule of the colonels from 1967, a dictatorial rule that only ended in 1974, when you had the Greek-sponsored coup d'etat against President of Cyprus, Makarios, and then the Turkish invasion of the island. So in 1975, it was a huge shock for the community. Of course, if you see the press at the time, there was overwhelmingly positive reactions. Democracy with you. They were so happy that Greece was back in the democratic fold. Of course, in private, and this is somewhere I got from Donald Maitland, who was the time permanent representative. He said that while we should certainly sing God Save Greece, we might also sing God Save our community, now that the Greeks are knocking on the door. And there were 3 main reasons why Greek application was presenting huge problems of the community. One had to do with the timing. Therefore, what happened is that in 1974 and 1976, the period we're discussing, out of the blue, all three Southern European countries that were under dictatorship suddenly democratized, and all of them suddenly knocked on the community's door, asking for membership. And although there was a huge kind of sense of compliment for the community, really realizing that they were a pole of attraction, also, it was an utter surprise because up until then, the whole Mediterranean policy was really kind of dominated by economic agreements, preferential agreements, association agreements, very few political overtones. To realize how unprepared the community was, they had decided in 1972 to dismantle the enlargement task force they had in place for Britain, Denmark, and Ireland because they thought, who is there to apply? The three Southern European countries are in dictatorship, the neutrals were our neutrals, and then, of course, Norwegians had tried twice, but their domestic audience wasn't approving their membership, and Iceland hadn't expressed any interest. Therefore, they were not prepared at all. And what is more, you can see from the cracks of the community edifice, the 1970s and mid-1975 when Greece applied, the West was dominated by economic malaise, which was mainly due to the Arab-Israeli war and the following OPEC oil embargo, which had brought about recession and high unemployment throughout the continent. And although there have been recent studies like Neil Ferguson's The Shock of the Global that kind of questioned the depth of the economic crisis in the 1970s, nonetheless, what all the historians at the time agreed was that the sense of doom was such because following 30 years of glorious economic growth, what was happening in the 70s was a huge shock. And the idea was that they were in a terrible situation with no solution in sight. That was the kind of the psychological element that was affecting progress. And this kind of economic downturn was translated within the institution. Several plans kind of completely demised. There were plans for an economic monetary union in the 70s to be completed by 1980. That was completely shelved because of the monetary crisis. And also there were efforts to coordinate the foreign policy. You have the newly created European political cooperation that had some successes with the Helsinki Act, but really had failed to transform the community into a credible global player. Also in 1975, it was the year where Britain had decided to hold a referendum over its membership, and the Commission and the institution had been dealing the whole year with these renegotiations taking place, which had been a huge burden on the community itself. Therefore, there was a sense of institutional and economic stagnation. And then it was Greece itself, as you can see, which was very poor. And when I say that, is that Greece had huge structural problems. And what is interesting is that Greece, during the golden years from 1970 till 1973, actually had the highest growth rate at 6.1, topping the average EEC, which was 4.4. The problem, though, was by 1975, because of the Cyprus invasion and mishandling of the dictatorship during the later years, there was huge trade deficits and a deepening inflation spiral because of the constant depreciation of the currency. But what was more was that the country had huge structural problems. The community knew very well that the country would have problems to really absorb the funds because there was no administration in place to really do that. So you can say, but Greece is too small. Actually, that's true. The kind of calculations at the time was that Greece entry would cost around 4% of the 1975 budget at the time. That's pretty much, this is minor. The problem with the Greek case is that from the moment they applied, they always saw Greece as part of the bigger problem, which was Spain and Portugal. They always saw Greece as the forerunner of the other two countries, and especially Spain, which would present many more problems. So if the economic and the institutional problems were not enough, Greece had the biggest challenge, which was it was on the verge of war with Turkey. And until 1975, the community had really striven to maintain an equal balance. We gave something to Greece, we had to give the same to Turkey. We see that with the association agreement in the 50s and 60s. Whatever they gave to Greece, they gave it to Turkey. The idea was that they are strategically important, we need to keep them both satisfied. The problem was if you accepted Greece, what were you going to do with your other strategically vital partner, which was Turkey, which of course was not ready to come in, and we know the story now. And what is worse, they really thought, the Europeans, that Greece would use the community as a channel of polemics against Turkey and as a forum to enlist support for Cyprus. Therefore, all of that were kind of encapsulated in the Commission's opinion. And I'm going to discuss very kind of thoroughly what happened with that. The Commission was, every time in enlargement, the Commission is asked to give its opinion, which is a document about the prospects and what ultimately, if they will give a green light for the accession talks to begin. And the Commission had a real struggle. It's one of the few times that the Commission publicly couldn't agree on what to do with Greece because they didn't know how to go about it. They understood the political considerations. They understood the sensitivity on how to deal with a country that has been recently democratized and is knocking on your door. But they were very aware of all the problems that the Europeans privately were talking to one another, but they would never publicly come out and acknowledge it. So after a lot of going back and forth, there were different drafts. The only drafts that went forward was that by the British Christopher Soames, who was the director of the External Relations Director General, Commissioner, and in charge of External Relations, yes. And the idea was that they would say yes, but with huge preconditions. And one of them would be a pre-accession period of 10 years at least, and then they will see how they will move forward. And what is more is that it actually mentioned the Greek-Turkish dispute, the idea that we need to resolve this huge problem and then move on with Greek accession. Of course, the Greeks were completely tormented. They thought that that will never be resolved. This means an indefinite pre-accession period, which is a lukewarm actual response. And Soames, actually, in a discussion with a Greek permanent representative, he said the avis will be satisfactory neither to the Turkish permanent representative nor you, the Greeks for that matter. If the Commission does not underline the hard facts of life, then who will? 2 weeks after the Commission gives this lukewarm opinion, the Council comes out and overrules the Commission, which has never happened before. So they took it in consideration. Within 2 weeks, they completely overruled it, and they decided that we'll move on, no pre-accession. The negotiations will start ASAP. And the kind of question is that why was that the case? The Commission was stating the truth. All of these issues that were raised in the opinion, and it was a long document, were giving the Nine a collective headache. All of these were true. So why would the Europeans so quickly, within 2 weeks, actually overrule the opinion? The Financial Times and the press in general really thought that this was just pure coincidence, saying if Greece becomes a member, it will be largely by default. And the idea was that the Greeks had so much used the rhetoric of democratic norms and this idea that we were knocking on the European door as a way to safeguard the democratic institutions, that no member state wanted to be seen as opposing such a noble cause. And what we now, in the Eastern European enlargement cases, this has been called rhetorical entrapment by political scientists. This idea that in a way, when you want to justify your preferences, you do it in a normative basis. Therefore, anybody who disagrees with you, you can usually use this normative argumentation and make them, coerce them in a way to say yes. What I found interesting in the Greek case is that this saming strategy, as Simon Flanagan goes on about it, is that it's completely novel. And why I found it so interesting and actually so effective is that something is happening in the 70s that is not happening in the Eastern European countries' case. In the 70s, the community is not still that normative community as we know it now. It was simply an economic community that was trying to find its raison d'etre. And what happened in the 70s, because of the crisis, defining Europe became a huge issue. They were failing on so many fronts, and they were trying to find a new purpose for integrating, for moving on. And with Greece and then Spain and Portugal knocking on the door and asking membership as a means of safeguarding their democratic institutions, provided exactly that community can be a political community and can promote democracy, and that could be one of its defining purposes. And that only happened really in the 1970s. It was the time when they were trying to define, as I said, European identity. They had made some efforts in the early 70s with the document on European identity of 73, but because of the enlargement and because of the debate, kind of brought about, there were like these arguments were refined and redefined. So talking about the Greek case kind of strengthened these ideas of democratic promotion much more, and kind of contributed to the building of the community as a promoter of democracy. And because it did that, the community had an identity it had to live up to. Therefore, it created a reference point. If you were promoting democracy, you couldn't actually say no to an applicant that was using exactly that kind of argument. And I find that interesting because democracy was not enlisted in the treaties of Rome. It wasn't one of the main purposes. In the 50s, it was about peace and liberty. Democracy wasn't even mentioned in the Treaty of Rome. It was a norm that came to be much more dominant in the 60s when Spain tried to gain membership, and then much more when all three of them asked for enlargement. And the fact that it was Greece, the cradle of democracy, made it the perfect case study. And the person who embraced the notion much more than anyone else was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was then the president of France. And just to give you an indication of how much really they believe that Greece belonged, not because of its past, and exactly because it was conceived by the public as this notion of cradle of democracy, when there was this ongoing discussions and rifts between the Council of Ministers and the Commission, Giscard very famously said to Ortoli that you cannot play Platon on the second division, and leaving him no room to really say anything else. And this was used again and again in several contexts to kind of stop the discussion about economics or tomatoes or oranges, because ultimately this was about the finalité politique of the community. But what I found much more interesting, and it was kind of adding to the ideational element that was taking place in the 1970s, was that there was a Cold War framework against which the Greek enlargement talks were taking place. And the idea was that really the question of Greece's EEC membership was couched in Cold War terms. And to give you an indication of what that meant, and an illustration of the discussion is in this telegram by a British diplomat to his other European counterparts, where he said, "I agree that we should not take for granted either the long-term stability of democracy in Greece or Greece's commitment to the West, since it's highly unlikely that Western countries can encourage this commitment and with democracy by giving Greece what she wants over the Cyprus and Aegean disputes, and indeed there is a danger that the Greek disappointment in these areas will have an adverse and possible disastrous effect. The West's chief opportunity to encourage the Western connection in Greece is to facilitate Greece's entry into the European Economic Community." In other words, what happened in the period from 1974, when Greece turned democratic, and 1976, when the Europeans actually said yes and the negotiations took off, was that the nine member states at the time really realized that granting membership was the only way to mitigate and really dispel any anti-Western feelings that were dominating the country. And there were such feelings. In 1974, the dominant opinion of the Greeks was A, that the dictatorship was implemented by the Americans, and also that the West, that's the public perception, and also that the West was completely complacent during the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. Therefore, the anti-American feeling was so dominant that any leadership, even Karamouzi, who was really conservative, pro-Western figure, and he really believed in NATO and the Western alliance, was forced in 1974 to withdraw from the military wing of NATO. For Greece, that was a huge reversal of foreign policy. What I claim in my book and what I claim in the archives, he really never believed in that reversal, but he was forced to because of domestic constraints. And that's how important anti-Americanism was. It was restricting the Greek leadership to act as they wanted, and also it limited the leeway that the Americans could have in the 1970s. And what is worse, for Karamouzi and for the Europeans, you had the rise of Andreas Papandreou. Again, the son ruled afterwards. It's the same story. But Andreas Papandreou was representing the radical left. And he was anti-European community, anti-NATO. He really wanted to have a non-aligned policy in the 1970s. And he was representing the rise of domestic left that really limited Greece's Western orientation. Therefore, Karamouzi went to the Europeans with a very viable case that the anti-Americans didn't leave him a lot of leeway, so he needed to have a foreign policy success. He was losing on all fronts. But also that the fact that he dominates the political scene doesn't mean that the Greek political system is stable. And that was something that was a kind of a great strategy, because it made a threat that was viable, but at the same time recognizing that Karamouzi was really a pro-Western figure. And the fact that Papandreou was becoming so popular, and actually in the 77 elections, his power grew exponentially, was adding to this kind of threat. Therefore, what was happening, because of the situation, the Nine really understood it in full cooperation with the Americans. They understood that they have to give Greece a foreign policy success and make sure that that would add and cementing their Western orientation. But what made it even more important was that Greece was not alone. And you have this constant idea of a spillover effect. So you can see here, it's a really bad sketch, I'm sorry, the definition. The community is the car, which, as I said before, is completely broken, is the mid-70s. It's not working. And it has all this package, which has nothing to do with it. But what you have Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey at the very end waiting to get on this car. Therefore, when I talk in geopolitical terms, Greece was not alone. It meant that what had happened in these crucial years of 1974, 1976, which actually was the fourth presidency years, was that Greece had this very unstable political situation, which was made worse because of what was happening in the neighboring countries. So in Portugal, you had several months before, in April 74, the Portuguese Revolution, and for almost 2 years, you had almost 16 changes of government and military communist-led officials taking over. Actually, the situation in Portugal was so bad that Kissinger said it's lost for the West. Maybe we should let Portugal go. That was how negative the assessment was, especially for the American side. The Western Europeans were much more positive and ready to support Soares. But what more, Spain, Franco's death was nearing in 1975 with unexpected consequences. But what made it worse than anything was Italy. Italy in the mid-70s was beset by economic, social, and political turmoil, and the communists at the time was about to get in power because of the historical compromesso. Therefore, what you had was suddenly, out of the blue, all four countries in crisis, and both sides of the Atlantic realizing that they cannot treat them ad hoc basis. They need to see adapt a holistic approach. And it's during this period that the term Southern Europe in the archives comes up. And when they mean Southern Europe, they mean these four countries all in crisis. And they would need a holistic approach because there was this element of a spillover effect that was dominating their minds. Therefore, it was only in this context that Greece was a Cold War crisis, because the idea was that if we don't solve Greece, we don't know what the effects will be in the other countries and vice versa. This is how at least the Europeans in their transatlantic discussion and intra-European discussions were presenting the Greek case. Therefore, this is May 1979, where Greece signs the Accession Treaty in Athens, in Zapio, which again is an aberration that never happens. The treaties are signed in Brussels, but the Greeks thought that it would be really symbolic to have all of the Europeans coming to Athens and celebrating Greece's entry. And at the time, Karamouzi, who is in the middle and signing the treaty, said that this was a historic day for Greece. But what I'm claiming in my book, it was that a historic day for the community, actually, even much more. Because what I tried to explain is that I think the community was steered in directions that they didn't really expect because of the Greek entry and, of course, Spain and Portugal that followed. And why is that? First of all, during the Greek case, the community really kind of witnessed an emergence of a new sense of purpose of enlargement that didn't exist in the first round. This idea that was really cemented, we take it now for granted, but in the 70s didn't exist, that as a community we will promote democracy, as a community we will represent values and norms that didn't exist before, and lure these new applicants in. And kind of adds to this historiography that really says that to understand the emergence of Europeans' political identity, you shouldn't look at the drafting of a treaty or the crafting of a court opinion, but it's an incremental process which takes place through several events, out of which enlargement is the most important. Because enlargement is a vital moment where the European community and now European Union thinks about itself, what it represents, where it wants to go. It asks these questions of who we are when someone is knocking on the door asking for membership. But what is also important is that the Greek accession was really a solution to a Cold War crisis. And it's very easy to forget that 40 years later, how possible was the war with Turkey, how unstable the situation was in Greece, and how real was this spillover effect from Greece to Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Therefore, accepting Greece and the rationale behind it really added to the community's collective weight, and also translated enlargement as a foreign policy tool. We take it now as the most successful foreign policy tool, even now when enlargement is in crisis. But the community really realized its potential during the Greek case, and then of course it was strengthened much more in the following rounds in the 1970s. So asking the question, was it a mistake? No, it wasn't a mistake in the 1970s. It wasn't a decision taken by chance. It wasn't a decision because they were embarrassed. What I really saw that it was a meditated decision. It was in the time they took it on why they should say yes, the reasons made complete sense. What is the problem with the community, and I think it happens even now, is that there's no long-term policy. So therefore, the politicians in 74, 76 had viable reasons for saying yes, but they didn't discuss at no point on how they are going to reconcile economic threats, geopolitical needs with the threat to cohesion and with the country if they will be able to actually adapt to the community. And ultimately, I remember I was doing an interview, and I'm not going to disclose his name. He told me they were politicians, they wanted to win the next elections. Who cared in 10 years what would happen to the community and to Greece? And kind of showcase that they were trying to solve a crisis at that point. Even democracy, which have been going on and on, it's remarkable how the community fails to define it. They're trying again and again, but they cannot come up with a definition that will really represent and can be part of the acquis. And what is interesting as well is that what also happened is that for all their talk, they don't really evolve. So in 1977, when Spain and Portugal have also formally applied for membership, the Commission published a document when it says we're going to bear the lessons of the first enlargement and the peculiarities of the second in mind, but they really only honor the first part of the pledge. And Lord Honey noted in his memoirs years afterwards that the community, and I quote, was long on warm words and short on substance, with emphasis on the acceptance of the acquis and on agreeing on transitional measures rather than changes of substance of policies. And it's true that during the 1970s and early 90s, there were many reforms and ideas tabled to make the Greek accession more constructive for the applicant, but also protect the community from the threats. But the idea was that the community decided to really kind of maintain the defensive character it had first acquired when Britain applied for membership in 1961. And because back then that application was conditional and the community was still kind of a nascent organization, the whole idea is that the doctrine of the accession negotiation was that we're going to protect our current institutions, our current member states, and we make it as defensive as possible. And the applicant, what they need to do is just negotiate the transition measures. So you need to understand when every applicant in the enlargement, in the Greek case, they're not negotiating the actual rules. They are not up for discussion. What they're discussing is the transitional measures, how long it will take them after they become members to adapt to the rules. And this is interesting because it's a kind of take it or leave it policy, which doesn't allow many leeway to the applicants at the time. And I think the Greeks kind of got wind of it. And one of criticism you can really put on them was that speed was the watchword. They actually did it so quickly and they said yes to everything because the idea was to get in. And paradoxically, I'm going to completely agree with Margaret Thatcher, who, when Gonzalez, the Spanish Prime Minister, was having another depressive meeting where nothing was happening and there was another impasse, he told him, EEC entry talks consist first of agreeing to a whole lot of things to get in, and then once in, trying to undo all the amazing things you agreed to in the first place. So the whole idea was that it was giving this idea that because there was no leeway and because the enlargement didn't change, the doctrine remained the same, despite the fact that you had qualitatively completely different applicants, recently democratized, economically weak. They needed a different kind of treatment, but that's why we shouldn't be surprised that when the next round came about knocking on the door, it was the same members who were recently candidates that were posing the biggest obstruction to the new enlargement, because they were recasting old bargains that they couldn't do when they were applicants. For Greece, of course, they obstructed Spain and Portugal, and then Spain obstructed Eastern European. Not the whole way, but I'm just giving you this idea of the vicious circle. Having said that, though, and that I think it's kind of, I'm trying to say into the book, in the throughout the book and the conclusion, was that a lot of things didn't change. But I think one of the reasons they didn't change was that because there was a crisis in their hands, a Cold War crisis that they needed to resolve at that moment. And there was no time, there were many ideas tabled, but there was no time to really implement them. And because this enlargement took place, and I think it became a reference point for other enlargements, and because during the Greek accession, then the Spanish and the Portuguese, the community really realized discovered the potential of enlargement as a foreign policy instrument. I think that Greece, within the historiography of European integration, should be added as one of the events, along all the others I'm listing here, that really showcase that 1970s shouldn't be seen as a decade of Eurosclerosis, but actually should be seen, as many historians are now talking about, as this bridge and formative decade that led to the revival of European integration in the mid-80s. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you so much. You have indeed made us rethink the 1970s and Greece's accession. Perhaps Anne would like to comment.
One hardly needs to have a commentator when you have such a challenging and brilliant presentation, and the book is wonderful. I've read it. I read the thesis, which was very good, but it's a wonderful example to any doctoral students who may be slaving away over their theses, that how an extra year you can turn a really good scholarly thesis into a genuinely readable book, which is, it's quite, for academics, it's quite interesting to have a readable book. I think what I'd like to do is try and, Eirini is still being a little tentative about what she's achieved, so I'm going to make a few points about the historical context, and then I'm going to make a few perhaps more inflammatory points about what I take from the reading of her book about Greece today. So there are two parts of it, and I will be very brief. Historically, I think that Eirini threw this up at the end of her presentation, but she's one of the first to nail down the fact that the European community lived in a period of Cold War, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up to the 90s, and that you cannot simply isolate the community from the wider Cold War environment. It was, as the political scientists would say, a nested institution. And the interesting thing about the 70s is increasingly Europeans began to see the West as the United States plus the European community, and not, as some Euro feds had thought earlier on, as the new way forward of being the European Union, I'll call it that, it was a community, without the United States. So there's a very important Cold War dimension to all of this. I'd completely agree with what she says about the 1970s as a decade that wasn't just one of frigidity, stalemate for the European community and for Western Europe. In fact, enormous things were happening all the time, and not just that rather polite list at the end of your presentation. The US was on the back foot. This is after Vietnam. There's the emergence of China and the whole shifting in the nature of international diplomacy. There was great excitement that these neo-fascist authoritarian regimes in southern Europe were experiencing very substantial changes. Greece, Spain and Portugal, which you mentioned, all of them. But there's also the terror across Europe about what do we do if the oil dries up. The impact of the oil crisis, Yom Kippur, were fundamental to Western thinking. This 69, Gaddafi comes to power in Libya. So the Middle East is beginning to change its face too. And there is enormous fear about how NATO will actually manage to adapt to this changing environment, which is not only European, but global. At the same time, there is Ostpolitik, which we all know about, and the rise of a human rights agenda in Europe and more widely, typified in Europe by the rather underrated CSCE process, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, where human rights issues, bracket aka democratization for many people, became was foregrounded, to use a rather inelegant phrase. So that notion of change and things actually happening is very powerfully presented in Eirini's book. Secondly, the European Commission was not sitting on its hands either. It's very interesting that it did not want Greece to join quickly in the 70s. And part of the reason behind that is that they knew Greece wasn't ready economically, and everybody knew that. But it was also that they began to realise that when institutions admit new members, they too have to change. That it's not a matter of the big institutions standing still and letting new people in, but that everybody has to change when you get change. Now, when the Brits joined, and after several efforts, in 73, when they finally joined in, the notion was, and a British diplomat said this himself, if you want to join the community, swallow the lot and swallow it whole. You had to go in on their terms. The commissioners now knew that life wasn't quite like that, and they were nervous about the impact upon the community as a whole of enlargement and how this would play out, not just for Greece, not just for other applicants who would come trotting down the road to the collapsed car, but to the institutions of the Commission themselves. And they were changing. A lot was going on within the Commission in this period. And I think that that comes out very nicely in Eirini's book. Thirdly, the notion that because Greece had returned to democracy of a sort, it should therefore be admitted to the community, re-emphasises a point that many people who are interested in the Cold War now make, and that the tools of the Cold War are not necessarily military. The tools of the Cold War are cultural and politico-cultural as well. That is to say, if Greece loses its place as a freshly invented democratic state, however iffy it was, then you had an impact on the nature in which the Cold War system was built. It wasn't just about territory, it was about what goes on inside the foreign policy making system. So therefore, in a sense, the tool, the Cold War tool that the community members with their American partners had, was to try to build in, reinforce democracy in Greece after they got rid of the colonels. So the strategic interest of where Greece is on the front line might be seen by some as a country which had strategic advantages. I think the Greeks have always thought they had strategic disadvantages. They really didn't see the pot as half full. It's also to do with cultural Cold War. And the last point is the point about individuals. And there are lots of good stories in Eirini's books. And I hesitate to ascribe to any sort of Cold War great man of history theory, and I don't by and large. But I do have to say that Karamouzi at least did. And he played the personality card for all it was worth. And Giscard swallowed it. They had lots of other reasons behind, but this was presented in a rather shallow way as key men standing up saying, you know, this is a great thing, we've got to do this, you've got to let us in, or else the whole system will collapse. And I think she brings out very clearly the role of individuals at moments of change. Now, those are the 4 historical points. And if I can be just a little bit more controversial in my last 2 or 3 minutes, and I've left that door open in case I have to make a quick exit. From reading Eirini's book, what really comes across to me is that the political culture and institutions of Greece haven't changed very much. I do apologise. This obsession with the recent historical past, and I'm not going to draw the parallels with today because you can all do that. There was an obsession with the recent historical past of the war and Turkey and Cyprus and how this played out in domestic political culture and dialogue. That's the first point. The second point is the influence of non-governmental institutions. Greece appears to have been a heavily penetrated society in the 40s, 50s and 60s, and it got even more heavily penetrated by business and other financial and commercial interests. Now, that's nothing that's particularly Greek, but it is particularly noticeable in Greece, and I was amazed by the coalition partners that the current Greek government have found for themselves. So I think that the continuities of political culture are very, very powerful. And this was combined with very fickle public opinion, because it's not clear how well embedded in the Greek mentalité was the idea of joining the community. And the reaction afterwards with PASOK and others was very, very striking. Which leads me to another conclusion from reading Eirini's book, is that othering in Greek political culture is very strong. They appear to look outside their own environment for things that have gone wrong and mechanisms to put things right. This was very, very true in the accession period. It was true in the decades beyond, and I have to say it's true today. There is a reluctance to examine their own navels while looking at the world around them. Now, I don't know why this is, I'm not a Greek specialist, but it comes over very clearly in the accession negotiations, and I don't think it's gone away that much. And the last thing, which is perhaps trivial, is the Greek capacity for drama. You know, all the world's a stage, and we see that today in the same way that Karamouzi was a hell of a good showman. He really knew how to draw his crowds, push the punches, get the big guys on side, and you saw the signing there, which was a phony signing at the end. And I find that as a sort of low-key Brit rather unimpressive, but this is a style which has not changed, which leads me to my very last point. And can we say that in fact the community, now the union, has managed to help Greece adapt to community norms, or allowed Greece to bring its own norms and change the community, as I talked about before, or not? You talked about the entrapment, rhetorical entrapment, and it's certainly true that the Commission couldn't say no forever in the 70s, nor by 79. But the question then becomes is how good a job did they do after 81? And I think the Commission was caught. They were very tough on the Greeks at several periods afterwards in the failure to implement legislation. They got the nasty old warning letters from the Commission. But in a sense, the Commission was and is today, it's damned if it does and it's damned if it doesn't. If it becomes very tough, you undermine the kind of notion of solidarity that Calypso writes so eloquently about, of cooperation and solidarity. But if it doesn't, it's seen as weak and unable to hold its own and to stop penetration of poor ideas into the community itself. So I think that the question about whether it was a horrible mistake or not to let Greece in is one that Eirini answered very well. But I do have to say that the way in which the community as a whole has managed its affairs with regard to Greece in the period since 1981 when it joined is one that actually leaves some questions open. And there I will stop with my 10 minutes precisely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. If I may just make one comment and then I throw it open, it strikes me that I like very much the levels on which you do the analysis. You look at the internal dynamics, the internal political cultures, you look at the union itself or the community itself, but you also, as Anne also points out, remind us of the Cold War context, not just in Europe, but the much wider context. And it seems to me part of, if there is a Greek question, it seems to me one that keeps recurring, that Greece so often stands in for something bigger. And so at the beginning of the 19th century, Greece stood for the values of classical civilization, for democracy, for the liberation of small peoples, which the Greeks both benefited from and used. And then, as you've pointed out, in the 1970s, again, Greece was seen as standing for the southern European nations moving out of dictatorships into a more democratic world. And I hope that at some point you both and the audience will reflect on what Greece is standing for today, because again, Greece, it seems to me, is standing for bigger issues than whether Greece works with the European Commission, that it's the Union. It's standing for austerity versus another kind of social model. And I think this is sort of seems to recur in Greek history so much. I may be wrong, but I'd love to hear what you want to say about it. But perhaps I can throw it out to questioners. Yes, Arfan.
Thank you very much for this.